All right, this is the last video in our series on the brain. And in this video, we're going to do the brainstem and the ventricles. On this sheet, we're going to talk about the brainstem, which is in light green. And it has three regions. You're going to want to draw a dashed line here. Whoops, make that straight across in there. And I just realized I want to do the ventricles first because this is a ventricle back here. And so we want to know what the names of these are. So I'm going to bring the ventricle page up. You want to flip to that in your packet. All right, here's that sheet on ventricles. And we actually have four of them. We've got number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. And then we have little sections that connect in between. And those sections have names as well. So the ventricle number 1 and ventricle number 2 are called the lateral ventricles. Lateral ventricles. I kind of think they look like a backwards Cincinnati red sign. And then the 3rd and 4th are just called the 3rd ventricle and the 4th ventricle. The 3rd ventricle and the 4th ventricle. The connecting regions, so this region is the interventricular foramen. Interventricular foramen. And back here we have the cerebral aqueduct. So this one is the cerebral aqueduct. And back, then leading away from the ventricles into the, around the spinal column is the central canal. Central canal. And you can see here too that it extends around the outside of the brain. We said a lot of that goes through the arachnoid layer into those cavities. But the ventricles are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, CSF, which stands for cerebral spinal fluid. And this circulates, it creates a circulation around both the brain and the spinal cord. And it's going to carry away waste, bring in nutrients, create a protection. There's a cushion here for the brain. So it has a lot of functions. It's produced inside the ventricles in areas called choroid plexuses. You don't need to know that, but for your information. But we did talk about the glial cell that lines these guys. Do you remember what glial cell it is? It is the ependymal cells. And those have cilia, and they beat their cilia, and that causes the circulation. But what we're going to see is this 4th ventricle provides a landmark when we're talking about the brainstem. So that's why I wanted to do the ventricles first. All right, let's go back to the brainstem now. So we have region number 1, region number 2, and region number 3. And let's start at the bottom and work our way up. So region number 3 is the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. And this has a function of the base functions. So this takes care of basic functions like breathing, heart rate, breathing and heart rate. You cannot really sustain damage to this. It's not compatible with life. Friend of a friend had a child, he was in his 20s. He developed a benign tumor in this area and it was attached to the brainstem. And even though the tumor was not malignant, when they removed the tumor, it did damage to the medulla oblongata. And so he was on a ventilator then for the rest of his life, which wasn't super long because it's hard to live when you're on a ventilator. The area above that, and it sits directly in front of this, here's that 4th ventricle. 4th ventricle. So that becomes a landmark for us. Not only do we know that this region sits right in front of the 4th ventricle, it has this rounded shape. and this is called the pons. This does in the brainstem what the thalamus did in the diencephalon. It is a relay station. Its signals are traveling down to the medulla oblongata and up from the medulla oblongata. And so this is a signal relay station. It routes the signals as to where they need to go. That leaves the midbrain. We're going to talk about the midbrain a little bit more. So I'm going to do a dashed line around the whole midbrain here. And it's small, but there's a lot going on. First of all, it is divided by the cerebral aqueduct. So the front part, there's an anterior and a posterior portion. This is going to be anterior. It's going to be posterior. And the cerebral aqueduct runs right in the middle. So, and this is called the midbrain. This region up here in 1A has a compound called the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra. And what happens if we have in Parkinson's, when they went in and they dissected brains, what they saw was the substantia nigra looked like Swiss cheese. It had been almost hollowed out. So we see a lot of issues in Parkinson's patients with the substantia nigra. Oops, that should be a B, not a P. If we look at 1B, you'll notice here that there's two small bumps. If I look at this from a posterior view, so I'm going to draw in a posterior view. When we dissect brains, you're going to see, it should be a little bit off there. It should be centered. Get my white out, it's going to bug me. That there are 4 bumps. Together, these 4 bumps, actually this bracket works for us, are called the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina. And if you know quad means 4, and we've got 4. The top 2 have a name and the bottom 2 have a name. And the reason we're learning this is these are a really good landmark when you're dissecting brains. So if you you pull apart this fissure, you're going to see these 4 bumps, and then you know you've got the midbrain. The top 2 are called the superior colliculi, or colliculi. And the bottom 2 are called the inferior colliculi. Inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi assist in visual processing. So these help you process visual information. People will talk about this in relation to their peripheral vision. The inferior colliculi, on the other hand, help you process sound. So these work with auditory processing. So we learn these again, not so much for their function as that they provide a landmark in dissection. All right, so our takeaways are we've got our ventricles. Here you see the lateral ventricle, and we have the corpus callosum and the cingulate gyrus above it. The 3rd ventricle is hidden by the thalamus. We've got the 4th ventricle. This is connected by the cerebral aqueduct. And then these provide fluid and protection and things that the brain needs. Then we have the brainstem. So we've got the medulla oblongata. It's got your base functions, your autonomic let's add here 2 autonomic reflexes. The pons helps with rounding signals between the diencephalon and the midbrain down to the medulla oblongata. And then we have the midbrain here. And we talked about the substantia nigra, and we talked about the corpora quadrigemina. Okay, that finishes up the brain. I hope you found it as interesting as I do. And this may or may not be our last chapter, depending on the school year. All right, guys, as always, thanks. And that's all for now.